like everybody's got some food, so I guess we'll go ahead and get started here. I'm Connor Mountford.
And I'm John Colclazier, and we are the co-directors of the American Democracy Project here on campus. And so today we're going to be talking about gerrymandering and partisan gerrymandering. So we're going to kind of go over what partisan gerrymandering is, what its origins are. We're going to move into how it works. We're going to talk about just kind of the consequences for voters in areas that are gerrymandered before we move into some solutions on how we can fix this problem. So yeah, we'll go ahead and get started.
All right, so first, what is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is the redrawing of district lines to favor a particular party. And I should be clear here that this is partisan gerrymandering as opposed to racial gerrymandering. And gerrymandering can actually be traced back to 1812 when the then governor of Massachusetts, Eldridge Gerry, helped to redraw the district lines to favor the Democratic Republican Party over the Whigs.
Notice how he said Gary, not Jerry. If you go to Massachusetts, they say gerrymandering, and they're very, very protective about it.
Yes. So, gerrymandering, same concept. The districts are redrawn every 10 years following the census, and this is done predominantly by state legislatures, but we'll see a couple other options later on. And the districts redraw, these are for congressional districts, obviously. And yeah. Moving on. So, how gerrymandering works. There are typically two ways in which legislators go about gerrymandering. The first is cracking, and that's breaking up a voting block to dilute the vote so that there is not a majority so that the majority party would be broken up so that the other party can win. And John is going to talk a little bit about packing.
Then you have packing. So packing, that's when you take a whole bunch of like-minded voters. So after you get the census, you go look at these areas to see how people voted. And let's say you have a large Democratic population in one area. So you put all of those Democrats into one district, so it's 70, 80% Democrat. And so they're going to consistently always elect a Democrat, and they're going to be wasting a lot of votes. And we'll be talking a lot about wasted votes later.
Right. So if you look at this map, this is just kind of a little description of gerrymandering. So you can see in the first map, let's take that as a state, and 60% of the state is blue and 40% of the state is red. So if the districts were drawn proportionally and compactly, it would look like the second map there. And there would be 5 blue districts because there's a majority of blue in each of the 5 districts. So what they do when they gerrymander is, as you can see here, they've packed the blue vote into these corners, and then they've cracked the blue vote in these other 3 so that there's a majority of red. So while blue has 60% of the population in this state or on this map, the red actually ends up winning more districts than the blue. So, some consequences of gerrymandering. The first is the majority party can stack the deck in their favor. And
I don't know why you wouldn't
exactly
stack the deck when you can. Said state legislators, like, if they have the dominant, if they have control of, let's say the House, the Senate, and the governor, they can redraw districts however they want. So why wouldn't you redraw a district where you don't have to spend as much money to campaign, where you're more likely to be safe in your seat? Why would you purposely make your seat competitive when you can make it easier?
Right, and I mean, going along with that, you redraw the districts every 10 years. So let's say a majority party gets power in the legislature, in the state legislature. They redraw the districts in their favor so that then when the next election comes, they're more likely to have a majority again and then again and again. So it just creates this cycle where one party stays in power. And kind of one way to think of gerrymandering, stacking the deck in your favor, would be if your teacher gave you the option of everybody in your class with below a C, so the majority of the class gets to rewrite the syllabus, and they get to choose how they get graded. Why would you not? I mean, of course they're going to rewrite the syllabus so that they can get a better grade.
So it also undermines the democratic process. And how it does this is that districts don't represent their communities. And so urban populations are typically more democratic or left-leaning. And so as we talked about earlier, you can crack those populations out. So, you could be walking on one side of the street and your friend walking on the other side of the street could be in two completely different districts. And it can kind of seem arbitrary. And we'll see some maps where they've done this in cities in a moment.
Yeah, so with the breaking up of the communities, you kind of get districts that don't represent your community because you're cracking it up or you're packing so many like-minded voters into one district that they might not have the same interests, and then you're cracking up other like-minded voters. So you might have a lot of voters in one area, take like one city, and they have a particular preference of who they want, but that city is cracked up into 4 or 5 different districts. So that community is actually being represented by somebody who is not representing their interests, and we'll see a little bit about that later.
It also disenfranchises voters. So when you know that your district is packed in a certain direction, even if you are the majority vote in that district, where's the incentive to go out and vote? If you know that your representative is going to either be red or blue, and that can have adverse effects up and down the ballot on how people turn out to vote if they feel like their voice doesn't matter anymore. So for some people, it just makes gerrymandering seem pointless.
Voting.
Yeah, voting seems pointless. Gerrymandering seems important.
Yes. All right, so here is Pennsylvania, and as you can see, these districts are all sorts of funky shapes. They're all over the place. This is actually one of the most egregious examples of gerrymandering. This map was actually struck down by a court and they said they had to redraw it. So you can see around here like how the maps are all spread out, and even over here around Lancaster, that blue district, it goes in and circles around Reading there. So it just kind of goes in and grabs a whole city that's not even close to the district.
In Pennsylvania, correct me if I'm wrong, they voted for Barack Obama twice, and then they voted for Donald Trump. So this is a swing state. They swing in presidential elections. So you would expect to see Pennsylvania have their congressional districts, which they have 18 of them, pretty close to 9-9, somewhere along those lines. Pennsylvania is represented by 13 Republicans and 5 Democrats. So there's definitely something going on here. So like Connor mentioned, courts have struck it down. They're in the process of redrawing it. Are they going to get it done in time for their elections appropriately? Nobody really knows, but they'll have to do it again in 2020 after the census anyway.
Okay, and so here's one of my favorites. This is Columbus, Ohio. So you can see this is one community, but it's broken up into 3 districts. And you see kind of how they drew in here and kind of really narrowed it down to get these voters in this area for this district and really pack the other voters into that smaller district. And so, I mean, it's just really, you can see all the funky shapes and it's kind of fun to look at, but it's definitely not a good drawing or a well-drawn district. And like we said earlier with the districts not representing communities, here's Austin, Texas. Again, one community broken up into, you can see, 4 congressional districts there. So as opposed to drawing a community or drawing a district around Austin, one community, they break it up to dilute the vote in that metropolitan area. And so there are some states, moving on to solutions now, there are some states that have nonpartisan commissions as opposed to letting their state legislatures draw the districts. And those states that have nonpartisan commissions for congressional districts: Arizona, California, Idaho, and Washington. And there are actually 6 states that do it for state legislative districts. And that's, again, Arizona, California, Idaho, Washington, but then also Alaska and Montana. Does anybody know why there's more states that do it for state legislative districts than for congressional districts?
Some states only have 1 representative.
Right.
So the U.S. House of
Yeah,
Representatives.
so, exactly. So, like Montana and Alaska, even though they're these huge states, their population is so low that they only have 1 congressional representative. So, you have 1 district. And one pretty interesting example of a nonpartisan commission is the California Commission. So they were employed in the redistricting of California in 2011 after the 2010 census, and this district based their, or this entity based their redistricting on 5 criteria. So obviously equal population, all your districts have to be the same size, and then compliance with the Voting Rights Act. So where you can draw, that just means where you can draw a majority minority district, you have to draw a majority minority district. And then contiguity, so your district has to be connected. You can't have part of your district over here and part of your district over here with another district in the middle. Compactness, so we kind of saw that with the funky shapes earlier. You want to have your district as compact as possible. So you want to fit your required population in as compact of a district as possible. And then the really fun part that we'll get to is respect to communities of interest.
And so communities of interest are kind of, we'll go to that.
Okay.
What I wanted to say about California, California had a really bad problem from 2002 to 2012. During that time, there was one incumbent who lost an election, a general election. So what they did was, whenever they redrew their district maps, they made it safe for the existing people. So it wasn't necessarily a partisan gerrymander, but they agreed that they were going to make each seat that was existing at that moment in time safe for that representative. So these individuals would still lose primary elections, but they knew that in the general election, for the most part, with the exception of one time, that they were going to be safe. And so whenever Governor Schwarzenegger stepped in, he decided that he needed to fix that.
Okay, so moving into communities of interest. First of all, they have to be non-political. So you can't, that would negate the whole point if you had a community of interest that was all Republicans or all Democrats, or a community of interest that wanted one particular policy issue. Instead, communities of interest can be based on race, ethnicity, income, education, and age. But it should be noted that with race, that can't be the only factor that would violate the Voting Rights Act. So, yes.
What else could be considered a community of interest? So what the California Commission did is they went around to different communities and they would hold forums. Like, come tell us about yourself. Talk about your community of interest and why we should write district lines that encapsulate your group together. And my favorite one was there is a community in California and surrounding it that is really big on horses. And so they wanted to stay consolidated together so that they could pass or elect somebody or vote as a block together for somebody that would be friendly towards horse-friendly laws, which I found to be very fascinating.
Right, so they had people come in from all over the place to advocate for their community, so that instead of having districts that weren't, that didn't reflect the community, their constituents, you would have districts that better reflected who they represented. So you want somebody that's going to represent your interests in the Congress, and that's the whole idea of the communities of interest. And so California actually had a ton of success with this. There are some academic studies that measure the spatial diversity and stuff like that, but that's a little complicated for this time. But moving on, there is, wrong button. There's another kind of new and exciting way to measure whether a district has been gerrymandered.
That is the efficiency gap. So we got to talk about math now. So exciting. How we get to the efficiency gap is kind of a story about the Supreme Court. So Veith versus Jubileer was a gerrymandering case in 2005. And what they decided is they kind of voted along party lines for Democrats, for Republicans, because they don't want to get involved in redrawing districting. They think that that's crossing what the Supreme Court is capable of doing. They don't want to get stuck in the political thicket. But Justice Kennedy, he's always swing vote, and he kind of agreed, like something's wrong here that needs to be fixed. Like we shouldn't be drawing this to where it kind of violates people's right to vote. But he noticed that there was no way to determine if there was what I have written down. He said there was no discernible and manageable standard for adjudicating political gerrymandering claims. He's like, yeah, it's a problem, but how do we judge if a district is gerrymandered? So after that, Wisconsin, whenever they redrew their district lines and had their first election with the new districts, what happened was 39% of the Republicans elected 59% of the legislature. Some districts, after they redrew them, saw a 28-point shift. So Democrat-leaning districts all of a sudden became Republican, and so they filed a lawsuit. And it went up the courts, and now it's actually been argued in the Supreme Court, and they introduced a standard for how to tell if a district is gerrymandered. And that is called the efficiency gap. And the case for Wisconsin is Gill v. Whitford. So we have 5 districts. There's 100 votes in each district. So go across 5, 25, 60, 40, 43. I'm not going to read them all. Anyway, so 2 Democratic wins and 3 Republican wins. But notice how 275 people voted for Democrats and 225 people voted for Republicans. So the next step on the efficiency gap would be to determine the wasted votes within that district. So you come up here, and so all the votes for the individual who lost are considered wasted. So in the 75-25, the Republican lost. So every single person who voted for a Republican, their vote is now wasted. And so come over here, 43 wasted. And then how you determine the winner's wasted votes is every vote that they didn't need to win. So they need a 50% threshold to win. So every vote above that 50% for the winning candidate is now considered wasted. And so then you go through and you add them all up. And so there were 173 Democrat wasted votes, 72 Republican wasted votes, and then you subtract it. Come up with 101 wasted Democratic votes. Then you go through and you divide that number by the total number of votes, which was 500, and it gives you this nice little number. And then you take that number and you multiply it back into the number of districts, and that gives you the number of seats. So this number, they should have won 20% more seats than they did. And so there was 1 missing seat for the Democrat in this theoretical example. So one of the things that we were trying to look up while we were getting ready for this is if there was anything on the state of Kansas. And nobody had actually done it before that I could find, gone through all of the districts, added up all of the votes, and applied the efficiency gap formula. And I don't have a lot to do, so I had some free time. So I actually went through, did all of the districts in the state of Kansas, and then applied it together. So does anybody want to take a wild shot in the dark? Which party had the most wasted votes in Kansas?
Democrats.
Just yell it out.
Democrats.
Good work, Democrats. So looking at House elections, there were 58,044 wasted Democratic votes, which comes out to a 7.82% gerrymander, which is slightly below the threshold of what is considered a blatant gerrymander. 8% is typically considered the cutoff for that by most academic scholars. But whenever we move over to the Senate side, it took me way longer to figure this out than it should have, because I kept looking at it and I was like, there were 741,000 votes in the House elections, but there was 1,068,000 in the Senate elections. And then I remembered that almost half of the seats in Kansas ran uncontested in the last election. So we're not having very competitive elections, and this is why I think it kind of plays into this. Because there's 20 seats that nobody challenged the Democrat, and around 40 seats that nobody challenged the Republican. So, but whenever we moved over into the Senate, there was only 4 uncontested seats, and strangely enough, they were all Democrat seats. The efficiency gap there is 13.26%, which is considered gerrymandered by most academic scholars by a lot. And that comes out to around 5 seats. Yeah, they had 141,000 wasted votes. That's just kind of an interesting little tidbit about Kansas and how the efficiency gap applies there. They haven't made a decision on Gill v. Whitford yet. I've heard oral arguments. Hopefully that'll come out sometime in June. And we'll see where we go from there. I guess that, if anybody has questions.
Yes, what you're describing is a large part of the matter with wasted votes. But also, with the criteria you mentioned, the compactness, one of the demographic patterns in Kansas is Democrats tend to load up in big cities, whereas Republicans tend to be spread out more. So, to an extent, you're going to have the matter of Democrats winning their seat 80-20 and Republicans winning 55-45. But if you were to make it, reduce the efficiency gap, to what extent is that going to also counter just the basic residential patterns also?
So are you saying that like-minded people move to areas of?
Well, Democrats tend to load up in big cities, like you have
Yeah.
Pennsylvania there. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, yes, those are very heavily Democratic, okay? Now, you go out to the other areas, like Lancaster and Bucks County and a place like that, that's going to be much more evenly split, or, leaning towards Republican. So, for me, is that, yes, you could say that, yes, these things are gerrymandered to an extent, but a lot of it's also, there's only so much you can do by redistricting to reduce the efficiency gap, because the Democrats like to load themselves up into cities.
Right, and that was also one of the things that I wanted to mention. I brought that back. A large part of what can kind of seem like gerrymandering in the state of Kansas is, I think, just how many districts we have. We have 105 House districts and 40 Senate districts, and so these votes are really spread out. So there wouldn't be a good way to create these seats. he makes a good point that they're in these geographically similar areas, and everybody else is kind of really spread out. But for California, after they did theirs, and they didn't, when California did it, they made it to where they couldn't look at how these individuals had voted. And they actually have the lowest efficiency gap of any state. So it was very successful on what they did. So nobody really has wasted votes. It's like a 0.4% wasted vote in the state of California. So they did a very good job. And it's not that they would make a specific district for a specific community. Like, these districts would be made up of multiple communities of interest, and these multiple communities of interest might have competing needs and desires, but their voice stayed compact. And that was the point of the California Commission, was to make sure that their voices were together so that they were more powerful, instead of split up. That answered your question. Yeah.
So in the case of the California Commission, you mentioned that was that Governor Schwarzenegger was involved in establishing that. In the case of Pennsylvania, they're being ordered to redistrict by the courts. For the other 6 states or 4 states where they do use nonpartisan commissions, how did that come about? Was that because of courts, or was that generally because of was power given up voluntarily in those cases? How'd that happen?
So the other example is Arizona, that at least I know a lot about, and they just did it through their legislature. They decided that this would be the best way to do it. And most of these, they create a commission that's still partisan, and Arizona became very contested whenever they were redrawing their maps, because it's made up of 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then an independent. And there were a lot of fights in Arizona about how that independent wasn't an independent, and the governor disbanded the commission. A court had to reinstate the commission. It was not good, but they said that if we don't keep this commission going and doing what we're doing, we'll never be able to do this again. It'll just destroy the precedence of us being able to have a nonpartisan commission.
So these commissions aren't always successful in
Arizona, in the long run, turned out to be successful, but it took a lot of work to do.
California's is the best example of a successful nonpartisan commission. But going on with that more, there's court orders where they just order the legislature to redraw the district and not necessarily order them to have a nonpartisan commission. Yeah. Yes.
A lot of the results, of this are based upon the assumption that people vote straight party lines, correct?
No, so this only counts votes. It doesn't count people who are registered to vote. And so the efficiency gap just measures the people within those districts. Maybe they do have a really unpopular Democratic or Republican candidate. You can't measure that. But this is just, I wouldn't say that it just measures preferences within that area in a given election. You would have a more accurate number if you went over like several election cycles looking at these districts. But yeah, that's kind of the assumption.
So like talking about like the 2 different like hacking versus like breaking them up, which one, going along with like the commissions versus like trying to keep them as compact as possible, which one would you say is more important in the long run, trying to make sure that we are splitting up ideologically dependent on how the state as a whole feels? Like on that the chart you originally had, whereas like this state is 60% Democrat, 40% Republican, and making sure the district reflected the state as a whole? Or would it be more feasible to go towards the geographic, making sure that we're keeping the districts close together? Because like you showed the beginning where it was like if you had if you split them up evenly based on, yeah,
Yes.
that one.
Okay.
You split them up based on how the 40% blue, 40% red, so you district them to equal that. Geographically, that doesn't necessarily mean that's how that is. So it could be the same problem that you have with the red winning on the other side, just because it's set up the way that you have it, it looks like it would be correct. Does that make, am I making sense with that?
Yeah, yeah, and obviously this is a simplified model where you obviously can't break up states in straight lines all the way down.
Well, and that's what that's kind of what I'm getting to. I'm saying in the sense of like, if it wasn't perfectly, these 3 columns were blue and these 2 columns are red here, but a bunch of red is centered in one part of this and one blue is centered in another part, like, is it more important to stay in that geographic way that you have it in straight lines, or would it be more important to make sure that we split it up according to how the whole precinct as a whole votes?
Okay. I think I see what you're saying with the geographical compactness. So you want to have, along the lines of compactness, you try to have a district that's as compact as possible. So districts are roughly 700,000 people, so you want to fit that 700,000 people into as compact of an area as you can. And with the gerrymandering, with the packing and cracking, it would be cracking up, say there's like a city that has 750,000 people, and that would be one district. And instead of having that one district, you crack it up into several districts and spread the districts out, whereas going on geographical compactness, you would have this one district here because it's 700,000 people in one spot, as opposed to breaking it up across the entire state.
So what would you do? Yeah, that, I 100% agree with that.
Okay.
Now, what would you do in an instance of a city that should have like 3 or 4 districts? Do you know what I mean? Like a Los Angeles
Yeah, you can
type?
go for it.
All right. I'm gonna try to tackle this. So, the California, like I mentioned, they didn't do any type of looking at votes, how people vote, party registration, nothing like that. They just went off communities of interest, and it ended up working out for them. Arizona, how they did it was they looked at voting patterns, and they looked at how many people voted overall this way and how many people voted overall this way. And they tried to create districts that reflected that. And what they ended up doing was creating 2 Democrat seats, 3 or 4 Republican seats, and then 2 seats that were competitive. So, because that was kind of your first question, I think.
Yeah, kind of. My question now would be like in an instance of like a Los Angeles,
Yeah.
if you could see ideologically how they do, or find the communities that you want to kind of put together, would it be more, I don't know, maybe moral or whatever, however you want to describe it, to still take Los Angeles and split it up 4 individual districts geographically? Or would you want to try and split it up to where maybe you go a little bit too much into the northeast corner, but to fit the communities together, you want to do it that way? Because then you can get out of the compactness. You can have a Columbus type thing happen if you're trying to fit them in communities versus trying to fit them in compactness of geographic.
You gotta think when it's places like Los Angeles, usually like-minded people move to like-minded areas. It's like New York. It's like people who live in Brooklyn often think the same. People who live in Harlem often think the same. So like geographically, usually they're pretty close together already, which helps.
So the area the population of interest almost
Most
flows
likely be
based
together.
on geographic.
But it's just in the instance that it doesn't, just hypothetically speaking, it doesn't fit in a geographic compactness, then what is more important, the geographic compactness
Well,
or the
California
community?
doesn't have this like straight circle and squares. Like it kind of looks like those maps trying to catch those communities. So what you're saying is kind of what California does already. They try to keep as many communities as possible that can keep the population right. And so it's not necessarily compact geographically, it's compact
community.
By
Yeah,
communities.
that was the
Yeah.
majority of what I was trying to get to with that.
Okay, yeah.
Is it more important to do the California route and make sure that they're packed in communities versus packed geographically and it might not fit the community?
I think that just goes to what the commission values more necessarily, whether they want super compact districts that look pretty or whether they want districts that reflect community. So I think it'd just be
So
what
in an
value they
ideal
have more.
commission though, in an ideal committee, what would be the outcome? Which one would, as a committee that you would appoint, which one would you want? Would you want it to be more community? Or would you
I would want community.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would say communities of interest, but that's just my opinion on it, so.
I just want to bring up, I'm not sure that California is really representative of the rest of the country, and it's a highly urbanized
Right.
state. And so, yes, I could see where this model would work very well in California, but I mean, if you try applying it to Kansas, well, I mean, you've got several cities that tend to be Democratic strongholds, like Wichita and Topeka and that.
Right.
But for the most part, you're not gonna go around the problem, but the Democrats are loaded into a couple of major cities, and then the rest of the population is much more spread out. I mean, I don't see how that model really would apply, you know, say to Kansas or other states like that.
Right, as more of these commissions kind of become commonplace, they're gonna have to expand out, find what works for that state. You can look, and this is actually in ours, Kansas has in our requirements that you have to pay attention to communities of interest, which is why you no longer see Mass Ave and Lawrence split right down the middle. So it wouldn't work necessarily the same way here, but you could still pull bits and pieces of it, find what works. There's a happy medium somewhere.
Right, there's no one solution that works across all the states.
Right.
You have to kind of make your solution fit the community or fit the area.
So the, whatever style they do use, whatever, methods they do use, the ultimate goal in any of the cases would be to lower that efficiency gap. That would be, get it to that like 4% ideal or whatever it is California has.
Yeah, but like I said earlier, whenever California made it to where it was kind of an incumbent's paradise, like those districts would also have a low efficiency gap once you looked at like the entire state as a whole. So you have to find a way to make it competitive if it's going to be competitive naturally. Sometimes you can't force it.
So how would you judge success aside from the efficiency gap? Like, if you could, like, X, Y, Z are the factors we judge success by, what would those be? Efficiency gap is one of them. What's Y, Z?
I think you can still have a higher efficiency gap number, kind of like Kansas does, and be able to explain it by geographical differences. So there's a lot of factors that plays into the efficiency gap. I think California can do what they did because they have such compact populations.
And going along with that, I mentioned earlier the spatial diversity. There was a study by Stanford, I think it was a few law professors at Stanford, where they made a spatial diversity score going through the American Community Survey and their popular initiatives. California has a lot of popular ballot initiatives where people vote directly on issues. And they went through the American Community Survey and popular initiatives and did the districts before the redistricting to give a spatial diversity score to see how diverse are these districts. And the goal was, ironically, we all think diversity is a good thing. The goal was to make them less spatially diverse so that you had more representation of a community of interest. Does that make sense? So,
I think so.
So if a district is very spatially diverse, there's a higher likelihood that your representative doesn't represent your community. But what their study did was to look at whether the California Commission made these districts less spatially diverse so that whoever they end up representing is a representative of that community's interest.
Yeah.
And so that would be one way where you could see, say, X is your goals, X is low efficiency gap, Y is spatial diversity, that kind of thing. Yes.
Another one with like the communities, is there a possibility that the communities splitting up based on like-mindedness could possibly create more polarized politicians? Because if you're sticking people that are all like-minded in a sense, like they're gonna pick people that represent them, but they might not be really moderate in the sense of that, then you can get a bunch of people with different opinions in the state houses and not get anything done in the end goal.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Communities of interest are supposed to be nonpartisan, but obviously if you look at other demographics, those demographic groups tend to vote in a certain way. I think the goal of having communities of interest is just so that you have representatives that represent your community in the House. So you want to have someone that actually represents your interests. They might be more polarized, but
So they'd be a little less susceptible to working with other candidates that aren't like-minded, though, is what I guess I'm trying to get at. Like, does that make sense? I'm not trying to discredit the
No,
idea.
yeah, I see what you're saying,
Just-
yeah.
That's a big, like,
No, it's
thing that I see as an issue.
good point.
Yeah, it's a
But,
good point.
oh, if, you know, a specific group has a large enough population to where they, I guess, would have their own district, but in California, they have such low numbers in their House and Senate that they don't. They have these large districts, so you have these big enough populations where you have multiple different communities kind of vying for that power. So it's not just one community, one district, it's multiple communities in one district, and it's making them competitive.
Gotcha.
So, but that could be a problem. But they'd be more beholden to the voters, I think.
Yeah.
And the voters' issues. I think it might help to take out some of that party politics. But I don't know, because it hasn't been done long enough or large enough to be able to tell.
For instance, as opposed to voting party lines, you would vote for your community, even if your community wanted something that wasn't necessarily along party lines, you would be beholden to that community, like your constituency.
Gotcha. So it would probably make, in a sense, more not straight line Republican or Democrat candidates, it would be people more specific to
More
what.
community
Yeah.
candidates,
That makes sense.
more of a horse laws.
We all need those. So if a commission like this was made in Kansas, which I don't think that anybody in government right now is an issue with the efficiency gap, the way it's working. But if like that happened, what do you think they would do about somewhere like here in Hayes, where you have a large population of the people who like live here generally all their lives and whatever are very conservative, but then you have the college students who vote in this district that are not as conservative most of the time. There's like a really big competing values. What do you think they would, like, what would you do with that, or what do you think like they would do to fix that challenge or deal with that challenge?
It's still, like, our district still encapsulates both of those communities. So the communities are still together, it's not like they're split out.
Yeah, so, but like if you're doing like community, I don't know, just the representation gap, do you think that that affects it then? When there's places like Hayes? Because I know like in California, it's pretty, the university towns probably are pretty similar, but like in places like Western Kansas, it's not as like clear. So if you're thinking about like those community interests and things like that and working on diversity, you know, I lost the question. You're doing a really great job presenting.
We'll come back to you. I think we had someone over here we skipped over a couple times, so.
So where did the 8% come from? Was that an arbitrary 8% efficiency gap? Where was that determined at?
Like I said, that's why I kept saying most scholars kind of agree on 8%. I actually never saw them use anything besides 8%. I can't remember where it was, but they determined that, you know, just in an election, the party that gets the most votes gets a certain amount of cushion. So let's say they win 51% of the vote, but it'd be okay for them to have 53% of the seats. So the higher the vote count that they won by, they just get a little bit of extra cushion each time. so I think that 8% is trying to account for that cushion, that it's okay up until 8% because that's just kind of, you know, the victor's spoils that they get. So, like all numbers, it's kind of arbitrary, but I think that there's some method behind the madness. I don't think they just threw a dart at a board and like, hey.
Just real quick, going back to the interest, I was kind of wondering, because you said about 700,000 in the district is a good number, is what they're looking for. Is there a threshold of interest, because you like to have the different groups of interest within that district, is there kind of a threshold of the size of a certain interest or populace of interest that would constitute redrawing a boundary, or kind of sweeping that arm out and grabbing that community as well to sway that? Is there a way to kind of combat that, you know, we need to have multiple groups of interest in this district, or there are existing groups of interest in this district? Is there a threshold where that group is so large or so small that it's either not worth going for, or is overwhelmingly worth going for? Or is that even an issue?
That's a good question. I don't know of an actual number threshold for a community of interest where a commission would say, okay, they've met, okay, there's 40,000 people of this community, we want to encapsulate that whole community together. I don't know if there's really a number on it.
Constitution says 30,000 is the minimum number of people in a district.
Well, no,
For communities
I think,
of
yeah,
interest.
he's talking about communities of interest within a district, whether that community should be broken up or kept together. So no, I don't know if they actually use a number threshold.
I mean, do they kind of get pretty hard and fast about those 6 criteria of groups of interest, or do they, you know, pull out other ones or things like that?
They do, like we said, we
What
mentioned
about
the
horses?
horse thing.
Horses.
There's,
Yeah, so.
they had, the commission just basically said, we're gonna hold hearings, send us an application for if you wanna present at these hearings, and you can come and present on why your community should be kept together. And so you had people from all over with all sorts of interests coming to these communities, and they just kind of judged which ones they thought should be considered a community of interest or not, so.
If we think of Kansas as a state that's relatively non-gerrymandered, and Pennsylvania, Texas, states that are very clearly, very heavily gerrymandered, what are some of the other states that, again, are very heavily gerrymandered or relatively straight?
Maryland.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Maryland, so Maryland is pretty egregious. It's all over the place. I wish we had a.
Maryland's a weird shaped state already, and they made it weirder.
Then if you look at, not all of Illinois, but Chicago is pretty heavily gerrymandered. So we mentioned contiguity earlier. There's actually a district in Chicago.
Illinois is fourth.
That is part of the district's over here, part of the district's over here, and there's a highway that runs between them, and that is the part of the district that connects these two communities.
They call
So,
it,
yes.
They call it the earmuffs, and it's actually required that they do that to create a majority-minority district. That's where Luis Gutierrez is from. He's the Illinois 4th, and it's 86% Hispanic.
As far as relatively non-gerrymandered, I would think a lot of the less populous states typically are less gerrymandered because their districts are so huge. I mean, you look at Kansas's first, that district takes up 3/4 of our state. So it's harder to gerrymander when you have so few districts.
Like North Dakota.
Yeah, not gerrymandered.
Or Nebraska?
Yeah, Nebraska. Yeah.
I had a question about that 8%. So I was wondering, maybe he already asked this, was there any reason, because I know that percentage really depends, like if you have like 5 seats open, then 20% is really what matters, because that's an actual seat that has changed.
Right.
Is there actually anything worth if it's only like 8% and you only have 5 seats? Does that 8% really change anything?
No.
Okay, so is that 8% just be then because of the average number of seats that there's usually up for grabs, or is that just a number that they kept saying?
With low number of seats, you said it just doesn't matter. So there's like 20 some odd percent Jerry, because I didn't do the congressional one because they've done congressional studies on Kansas already.
Okay.
So there should be a Democratic seat in the state of Kansas because there's enough Democratic votes in elections, but like the first district never has a Democratic candidate, so it's hard to gauge how many people would vote Democratic like, in the first district. But like the biggest point for the efficiency gap is to point out missing seats. So if the percentage isn't high enough to constitute for a missing seat, then it's not really important. So like for Wisconsin, like I said, 39% of the vote won 59% of the seats. And so it's a very large gerrymandering. That would be another state that's real bad as Wisconsin. That's why it made it all the way to the Supreme Court. But yeah, I don't think if it translates into seats, that it could really make a huge argument on that we need to redraw lines to be able to boost.
So like in the instance that you're talking about how Kansas should have a Democratic
Yeah.
congressional seat, would that not require packing to do so?
Yes. Yes, sir. Yes.
Different version of that question. Okay, so if you're just thinking about like percentages and doing the majority minority, what kind of a challenge would Hayes present since there's such like a diverse population?
Do you mean with majority minority
Yeah.
districts?
Yeah, like making districts, because I'm sure that we don't have enough people for it to be like.
Yeah, and so that's kind of an interesting question because it's when you can draw a majority minority district, you have to. So obviously in Hayes, our minority population would not be large enough for us to be able to draw a majority minority district. But in areas where the population is large enough, you have to. And that's kind of why you saw the earmuffs thing, because they were required to draw a majority minority district. Yeah. Anybody else?
Well, thank you all.
Yeah, great.
for coming.
Thanks for coming.